Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for attending our Iowa Ideas Conference. My name is Brittney Miller, and I'm the Energy and Environment Reporter at the Gazette, and I'll be moderating this panel about extreme weather in Iowa. The session is within the Energy and Environment track. All of our sessions have closed captioning access and are all being recorded. Before we start, I want to take a moment to thank Alliant Energy for sponsoring our Energy and Environment track. Please join me in watching a quick message from them. Now I'm thrilled to introduce our 5 panelists for the session. Aaron Graber is an engineer for ITC Midwest, a transmission company headquartered in Cedar Rapids. He works on improving the resiliency of our electrical grid to extreme weather and adaptations to climate change for utilities. Mark Licht is an extension cropping systems specialist at Iowa State University, who studies adaptation to weather events and agricultural adaptation to a changing climate. Tamara Marcus is a sustainability director for Linn County, who is creating a greenhouse gas inventory baselines for the county. She previously completed 2 years of climate change research in the Indian Himalaya. Dennis Todey directs the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Midwest Climate Hub in Ames, which focuses on the wide range of climate change and agricultural impacts and interactions. Gabriele Villarini is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Iowa, who researches extreme events, climate change, and forecasting. He also helps lead the Iowa Flood Center, which researches floods and resiliency efforts in Iowa. There will be a short Q&A session with the audience at the end of the session. Feel free to post your questions on Whova, and I will dictate them to the panelists as time allows. And now, without further ado, let's start with our discussion. To start off, I wanted to start with the basics of extreme weather. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's climate hubs define extreme weather as occurrences of unusually severe weather or climate conditions that can cause devastating impacts on communities and agricultural and natural ecosystems. To the panelists, how does Iowa experience extreme weather, and what are some notable examples of extreme weather events in the state?
Well, I think I can get started. I experience it, I think, in an interesting way working in the utility business. Whenever there's an extreme weather event, we see a lot of power lines go down, and I get to work a lot of long hours as an engineer to try to restore those. So, for us, what's the most severe in terms of keeping the lights on? Well, it's the ice storms, it's the derechos, and we all think about the one that happened in 2020 here in Cedar Rapids, but there have been others. 2011 there was one in Vinton. Just last December there was one down in southeast Iowa, and those are the things that we really look at, and we try to make sure the grid is resilient to those, and we can get the lights back on in a timely manner.
Yeah, and I'll riff on that as our resident climatologist here. We have sets of severe weather that exist around the Midwest. That derechos are the ones that Aaron brought up. These are widespread wind events that we've known about for a long period of time, actually identified in Iowa about a little over 100 years ago. Ice storms are one of those. Tornadoes are not as widespread as, don't have as much of a land area that are damaged as some of the derechos, but are very damaging in the areas that hit them. We avoid some of the other big events like tropical systems that affect the Southeast. Those don't make it up to our area, fortunately. But we have a wide range of these, and they've captured a bit more of attention these days because we have had some very extreme ones. Aaron brought up the 2020 derecho, which, as derechos go, is about as severe as you would expect to see, and we can talk more about that as we go along.
And just adding to what Dennis just mentioned, I think floods and droughts are also part of the set of hazards and extremes that we are very familiar with. And the dichotomy here is that they tend to almost alternate. So there is some of these issues with the extremes is not their magnitude only and how big they are, but also their variability. So some years can be extremely wet and we prepare for floods, and then the following years you might just have devastating droughts. And so that's how they affect, they have big impacts on the communities, the ecosystem, the agricultural environment in which we live.
And just kind of from a county perspective, Linn County experienced three major extreme weather events in just a short time, about just 12 years, 2 flooding events, and then the derecho of 2020. And these were record-breaking events, right? At one point, the flood of 2008 was, I believe it was, the third most costly FEMA flooding event. That since changed with, more extreme events across the country having occurred. But again, derecho was a record-breaking thunderstorm event. I believe at estimated around $11 billion. So, these, just kind of to contextualize this and kind of our human systems, right? Our government systems, and really to, start thinking about kind of the economic impact that these disaster events can have on our communities too.
And the 2020 derecho is the most expensive severe weather event in the US that we have recorded. That's not, hurricane tropical systems are separate, but the largest severe weather event, most damaging, expensive severe weather event was the derecho.
Exactly.
You all have mentioned how these extreme weather events have changed in Iowa over time. Can we talk about what's driving this change and how we know that?
From a climatological perspective, we know these types of events have existed. We are learning more about them as we go along, and we're having to do some modeling and then trying to do some historical assessment of this. It's a bit difficult to determine exactly how they have changed because we don't have as detailed information about large events previously. We know damages from large events, but we don't know how strong the winds actually were because we don't have quite the information for that. But when like NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has a track of severe weather types around the country, and the amount of them and the dollar value associated with them is increasing in the data they have since 1980.
And Brittney, when we think about floods, in a sense, we can think of them as integrators of a number of different processes. They are integrators of the rainfall falling on the ground, the rainfall that is in the ground itself, depending if we're dealing with snow melt. So it integrates a number of different factors. And when we look at the data that the U.S. Geological Survey, or USGS, has been archiving, disseminating, and providing to the community, there are certain features that are harder to capture as far as changes. So in particular, think of the magnitude of the events. If you look at every year, the largest flood and how it changed over time, sometimes it's hard to detect changes because these are extremes. So by nature, they're very variable. And so you need to there is a lot of noise in this data. But one of the things when we look at Iowa and the central US more broadly, the frequency of these events has been increasing over the past several decades. And it's not just an artifact of our short-term memory. We tend to put more weight to recent events compared to further away ones. But the data itself suggests that and provides empirical evidence that the frequency of floods has been increasing over the central United States, and Iowa included.
Yeah, I think from our perspective in terms of how we experience it in the utility area is, it seems like since I've started working in this business, about every 2 to 3 years we'll have a major event, whether it's a flood, ice storm, major windstorm. And so, it seems like they have been getting, closer together. It's hard for us to say, we're not the climate scientists and things like that. But I will say it's something we're trying to capture And I think the utility industry as a whole, not just ITC, we're looking at how can we work with folks who are climate scientists who can make predictions and models for the future and make sure that we're prepared for that, whatever the change may be.
Aaron, just upon mentioning future climate, what types of weather and climate do you think Iowans can expect to experience the next century?
Well, I think from my perspective, we've been looking at this a little bit in our company and in terms of how that would impact our power lines and our substations, and looking at some of the reports like the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, and some of the things they talk about there is that it may not be that we're necessarily going to see, we're not going to suddenly see hurricanes impacting Iowa, but what we may see is that there is going to be more often, rather than suddenly we're seeing tons of rain, we might see all of our rain in a few events, or we might see a few extreme events rather than several more moderate events. And so I think, I'm probably not the leading expert here on this, but I think that's what we can expect.
Do other panelists want to chime in there?
Aaron mentioned, the variability in precipitation. That is the one that people are recognizing. The modeling is still a bit difficult in trying to model precipitation processes and how it happens. But he's right that the expectation is we're going to see shifting precipitation to our cold season, winter and spring, and less in our summer. Large events are going to be more frequent, where you have, and this gets back to a comment Gabriele made about floods and droughts. And this is a way that floods and droughts can exist simultaneously, where you have a drought, but you have a single large rainfall event. In the way of Mark is nodding his head, so he can talk about that in the way of from the ag sector. But the other part is large storm events. These are harder to model and harder to assess looking ahead. So I would not say we're expecting more severe weather events. And I don't think the science is well versed in that one yet, but certainly the changes in temperature and precipitation are going to cause some differences in what we're seeing in the central US.
But Dennis, I think there's some subtle changes that are occurring that are not these, so to speak, severe events, right? So some of those reports are talking about having increased nighttime temperatures. Just lost some of the other, our springs are going to be a little bit warmer, those types of things. And they're not necessarily the severe events, but at least from a crop production standpoint, they can make some pretty big impacts on it.
Yeah, and I know that high heat events as well have been forecasted, at least in our particular region of Iowa. And that number, those high heat events, the number of them increasing throughout the calendar year. And so, that's kind of where we get into some of these connections to public health, right? And, you layer that on a community that's lost, upwards of 70% of their tree canopy, that also provides an additional level of concern, right? Because, it does have an impact on utility bills, for example, but there also are very real human impacts that we must consider too when we're thinking about what planning looks like to address some of these forecasted changes.
And Tamara, one interesting thing when we think about heat and heat stress, for instance, so it's not just the high temperature, but also the high temperature with high moisture in the atmosphere, those sticky days that we experience over the summer, is that one thing we found is that actually they're also precursor to flooding. So generally you can have these high heat events that precede the flood. And so when we think about some of the implication from a public health perspective, you find yourself in this situation where you might need the help. You might need to make it to a hospital, or you might need to get emergency vehicle to your place. But if there is a flood in the way, that can impact the way that you can get support, or you can be supported and aided. So as we think about how we move forward, those are those kind of interdependencies that might not be apparent right away, but those are important to also think about as we try to envision what the future would look like, thinking about how all the systems we're dealing with are highly interconnected and there are very strong dependencies.
Mhm.
Excellent point.
Several of you have mentioned climate modeling. For some, there's a level of distrust in climate models that forecast more frequent and extreme weather events. How much can we trust them in your expertise?
I'm happy to start, Dennis, and then
Yeah.
so,
I'm an observational guy, not a modeler, so go for it.
So I'm a wannabe many things, including using climate model data. So I'll give you my 2 cents on the experience. So we don't take these models lightly. So what I mean is that we don't just take them at face value, but actually we want to understand their strengths and weaknesses, and also if they're fit for purpose for what we're looking at. And so rather than just blindly using them, we want to convince ourselves that they provide the information that we need at the level and scale and resolution that we need for the hazard, for the extreme that we're dealing with. Admittedly, not all models are created equal, so some models are better performing than others, but we also don't look at just a single model. We look at an ensemble, a suite of models, identify the ones that perform well with respect to the historical past, and then we have to make the assumption that past performance is reflective of future performance. So if they work well in the past, we assume that they can perform just as well into the future. And there are a number of generations of these models that have been developed over the years. We have seen that the answers we get tend to be similar, from one generation to the next. The performance tends to be better, and performance tends to be better not just in terms of the processes that are characterized, but also the resolution. Earlier versions, basically Iowa was like 1 pixel out of these models, and now the resolution is such that we have multiple pixels and multiple and much more granular information for us to use. And so just like with any model, their approximation of reality, I think that if we do our due diligence, we can build our confidence in their suitability, and then hopefully convince the public or the end user that they are a good resource for a future for which obviously we don't have observations. So,
And another thing about the type of modeling that is being done here, it's a bit different from forecast models like the next few days. We're not trying to forecast what's going to happen on July 12th, 2045. What we're trying to project is, what does that decade of 20 to 40 and 20 to 2050 look like? How often are we going to have storms? How often are we going to have hot conditions? How often are we going to have cold outbreaks? That's what we're trying to model, which is a bit different from trying to forecast, is there going to be a thunderstorm in 3 days?
Yeah, and Brittney, just to kind of contextualize this too, and a greater, I think, and maybe it's mistrust, but I honestly think it's a lack of understanding of the scientific method generally. And we could see, I think, the impact of that in something like COVID, where this was a new enough occurrence, I guess, within our systems where, we didn't have the answers immediately. And so there was changing information coming out as we better understood the transmission, right? And all of these other kind of components of this pandemic. And so I think that speaks to kind of the need for more science communication around models, climate change, extreme weather events specifically, but then just generally about how this process works, because that's something that you probably learn, you know, in middle school or maybe in high school a little bit too. But then if you're not using it every day, it's very easy to be confused why this information is changing if you don't have a good understanding of this model. And so, you know, just platforms like this, for example, I think are really valuable to kind of remind people about these processes, about the idea that this is typical within STEM, to kind of have updated information as we know more. And I'm a climate scientist that doesn't work in the Midwest, but certainly in the Arctic, where I work, in the subarctic where I work, you know, I don't do modeling specifically, but my research contributes right to their modeling. And so again, just the complexity of a lot of this topic and how these are developed isn't something that you're going to get with even 1 hour session, right? And so the more opportunities I think that we collectively can create for people to understand STEM generally, scientific model, the better I think people will receive this information and build that trust.
I guess I could, if you don't mind, sorry. If I can add to, like, I think in some ways I've kind of got a little bit of, you know, both sides of the equation here. You know, this is something that I've been learning about over the last few years. You know, it's not, I don't do climate modeling as part of my day-to-day job, but I'm trying to understand how climate projections can impact us. And one thing I think that could help people, you know, it probably is a bit of a double-edged sword, but what could help people understand and relate to this is being able to localize it. You know, it's one thing when we talk about, I know the thing that's in the news is always, you know, a 2 degrees Celsius global temperature. That's what everyone talks about or makes the headlines. And, you know, but what does it mean for us in our local areas as individuals? And it's important to us, you know, from a business perspective to understand, you know, what's it going to look like in our operating territory, and what are those impacts that we can see, and what's the timing that we can see. And I think that there's just a lot of, you know, we're learning about it as people. And I think also probably as part of those who are, you know, directly involved in it are, you know, like Tamara said, are kind of, you know, learning new things every day.
Those are all really good points. Thank you all. I want to kind of pivot to the impacts that we've seen on different industries and sectors of Iowa from extreme weather over the years. I want to start with ag. So how has extreme weather impacted Iowan farmers and ranchers? Mark, if you want to start with that one.
Yeah, so I mean, these severe weather events, I'll say in some respects, aren't new, right? We've been dealing with, you know, wind events that cause lodged corn or hail events. I think the new part of it is the broad geography that's affected by them. You know, we think of the 2020 derecho, you know, that wiped out, you know, millions of acres of corn and soybeans, right? We can go back to 2009. There was a hail event that went, you know, pretty much across the state. You know, devastating, you know, almost mature corn, right? So I think when we think of the severe events, I tend to think of them happening on, you know, a little bit broader scale. And those are really hard to recover from, you know, quite honestly. And that's, you know, fortunately we have good crop insurance policies. We have good mechanisms to help, you know, the farm industry, you know, kind of recover from those. But I think there is some longer term things as we think about more like the flooding issues or wet springs, so to speak, that we can be managing. And so, you know, we are continually working with farmers to kind of talk through, you know, how do we change our, so to speak, our planting practices, so planting dates, and some of those types of things to be able to offset you know, those high event rainfalls, right? The other thing that I think we've seen, you know, a lot more, at least in the last decade, and I expect it to continue, is that, you know, we are seeing tile drainage go out and increase capacities, I'll say. You know, when I was a kid, you tile drain, you know, the prairie pothole, you know, that may have only been, you know, 5 to 10 acres. And now we're pattern tiling complete fields. So that way, after these rain events, we can get those fields to dry out so we can get into them a lot sooner.
I don't know if any but other panelists wanted to add. Dennis?
Yeah, I mean, Mark touched on this, and Gabriele can touch on this too. This shift we've seen in precipitation events occurring in the winter and spring and even somewhat in the fall, is especially concerning for us for the longevity of agriculture. Because when you have tillage practices where you're actually doing some tillage and turning up soil, rainfalls, especially heavier rainfalls on bare soils, are an awful practice, because the capability of soils to be able to produce crops, whatever type of crop it is damaged by the loss of that topsoil. And we lose topsoil much more quickly than we're able to regenerate topsoil. So that's an ongoing problem we have. It's also a problem with nutrient loss and offside into our waterways. And then there are some kind of even more subtle things in the way of we're talking about row crops. When we're talking about tree fruits or perennial type crops, changing freeze dates, changing winter or spring and fall freeze dates are having an impact on perennials because of the warming winters, crops breaking dormancy earlier, and then spring freezes damaging them as they're starting to become productive. So there's a wide range. That's why I joked earlier, Mark and I could riff on this for quite a while, but we'll go ahead.
Well, in that vein, we've talked about, maybe having higher frequencies of the high impact rainfall events in the spring. But we know that there's the likelihood that we're going to see warmer springs. So those two things kind of offset themselves when we think about it from a crop production standpoint. The more rainfall we get in the spring, typically the later we are with planting, but warmer spring weather typically can mean that we could have favorable soil conditions to plant earlier in the year than we have before.
Now I want to talk about how extreme weather can impact our energy grid. Aaron, I know you touched on some of those impacts. I want to ask, is our energy grid built to withstand extreme weather events? Why or why not?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good question. And especially, an event here in Cedar Rapids 2 years ago where several people lost power, thousands of people lost power for more than a week. It makes you wonder, I think, if you're not in this business. But I guess what I can tell you is, the answer is yes. We do design our power grid to deal with these extreme events, and there's really a few different ways we could do that. Number one is, of course, we can design our facilities to make sure that they can withstand these extreme winds and heavy ice loads. Make sure that we can keep our substations out of the floodplains, and and all of those kinds of things. And we definitely do that. There are industry code requirements that tell us that, and they do account for high winds and ice and flooding. But that said, you can't necessarily predict everything, and we could decide to design everything for the 500-year event or the 1,000-year event. But I think in this environment of inflation and rising energy costs, we don't need to be doing too many things to increase people's electric bills. But the other side of it that we think is very important at ITC is really that ability to restore the system quickly. And so, and that involves building in resilience into your system where okay, well, we may lose a certain amount of our power lines or some part of our substation, but then periodically we're going to build in stronger structures that are going to stop that failure at that point and contain the failure to a manageable level. And then keeping supplies on hand, having good business relationships with partners in the industry where you can get that material, you can get the workers there to work on it and restore it. I think the challenge that we have in our industry is that we've got a lot of stuff that's old out there, 50, 60, 70, 80 years old facilities. they're at or past their end of life. And so, whenever a major storm comes out, well, that's really when we see all those things go down. What you can also say too is we work on the transmission grid, which is the very highest level of electrical grid, the big backbone substations and lines that feed regional areas. When you get down to the more local facilities, the distribution lines and things, those are just, they're built at a lower standard because if one goes down, maybe it only impacts a neighborhood rather than a city. But when you have a whole city hit by it, each neighborhood goes out neighborhood by neighborhood. And so those are some things that we're thinking about in the industry. Should we be increasing the standards for those lower lines and things like that? So I guess that's a long way of saying, yes, it is designed for extreme weather events, but we understand in certain circumstances it will fail, and we're working to determine how do we best approach it to keep improving that performance.
Yeah, and I think there's opportunity for local governments, for example, and other potentially nonprofits and private entities to support that initiative to build in points of resiliency across our county and across our state. So something that's intriguing for a lot of our folks here is the concept of using EVs as kind of backup points of power. Because they're essentially mobile batteries that could be driven to where the need is greatest at that given time. And so as we're having conversations here about incorporating electric vehicles or alternative fuel vehicles into our fleet, that's something that we should certainly be looking at as serving kind of a dual purpose. And then also something that we've been working on in Linn County is resiliency mapping. So trying to identify these sources of resiliency within our community related to energy, related to internet access, right? Because just thinking back to post-derecho, those were kind of some of the most pressing needs, trying to connect with their loved ones to see if they're okay, and then also trying to figure out where you can access the resources that you need, especially if that is housing, right? And so taking advantage of these, what I refer to, and I think a lot of other people refer to as these in-between disaster times, to make sure that we're building up those points of resiliency, because we know it's not a matter of if, but when the next disaster strikes. And so trying to make sure that we're taking advantage to make sure that our communication systems are up to date. Communication meaning, connecting with all of these entities that are responding post-disaster, and then also that infrastructure piece as well.
I want to take a moment to remind the audience that if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, and I can ask them during our Q&A session at the end. Tamara, you mentioned, community resiliency. How do extreme weather events impact Iowa's communities, particularly the disadvantaged communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that I talk about a lot, just given kind of the focus of Linn County sustainability on ensuring that our climate vulnerable populations are prioritized in some of these adaptation initiatives. Because, we all experienced derecho, in Linn County, but that impact was not equal across our different neighborhoods and different communities. And so something I think, again, kind of, as we talk about this physical infrastructure, that certainly is important. But, there's all of these very delicate social networks that are also disrupted in these extreme weather events that are much more complicated and complex to repair. Thinking about Westdale Apartments, the west side of Cedar Rapids, where we had, complete devastation of apartment complexes, mobile homes, manufactured homes. And often these are individuals and families that are already kind of living on the fringe. And so maybe they had renter's insurance, maybe they've just both lost their home and all of their possessions. And then, thinking about, again, a lot of these social networks rely on one another to fill in gaps throughout their day-to-day. So say someone is making dinner for another's kids who works at nights, for example. Well, if that apartment complex is dismantled, then you might be able to relocate this person if you can find them good quality affordable housing, which is also an issue in our community. But then, okay, so we've relocated them, but then how do they make sure that their kid gets fed at night? So again, just trying to understand the complexity of the impact of these disasters, both on that infrastructure piece, which is important, and then also some of these social pieces that even still to this day, right, we're recovering from and trying to repair.
You've mentioned our infrastructure, so I wanted to ask, is our infrastructure prepared to handle more extreme weather events? Why or why not? And Gabriele, if you want to start with that one.
Yeah, so that's a complex question in the sense that everything that we have designed is in general is designed for the past. And so typically we don't design with the eye into the future, but we take our past record and use it as evidence for what we can expect in the foreseeable future. And so in a world where things are changing, one way or another, extremes are more likely, or at least we can't just simply assume that the past will manifest itself in the future. The question becomes, how do we design that? And the question about infrastructure, whether it's suitable, is also has to account how much are we eating into our safety factor. So when you design, you have safety factor that you embed in your design to account for the things that in a sense you don't know, the unknown unknowns. And so even though we might not have experienced a number of failure from the infrastructure, the question becomes, over the past many decades, how much of that is eroding your safety factor and how much is actual resilient infrastructure? And so those are the kind of questions that are really hard to address. And one of the things that I can say, at least from a flooding perspective, that's the kind of hat I usually wear, is the fact that from what we have seen under many of the scenarios that are part of the future, and as Danny said, we shouldn't treat them as a forecast, we should treat them as what if. What if we go down a certain path, and what can we expect? Flooding in Iowa, broadly speaking, and there on your point of making this relevant to the community rather than just at the global scale, is a very well taken point. When you look at communities in Iowa from a flood perspective, some of the results we are finding is that the flood risk is projected to worsen. So floods becoming larger and larger as we move through the 21st century. And so the question of the infrastructure is a tough one because we don't have, as of now, the tools on how to incorporate changes in climate that we might be expecting into the future in the design of future infrastructure. And so I think that there is room for improvement in a sense, at least realizing that past performance should not be viewed as evidence for future success. So just because what we experienced in the past was okay, we shouldn't take it at face value, and we should come up with ways, guidelines, documents, advance the research as far as how do we incorporate changes in climate that we can expect into the design of future infrastructure. And those are decisions that we have to make now. We can make them retroactively 20 years from now, unless we follow a more of an adaptive management, adaptive design approach, where we can just keep on making changes as time goes by without committing into a specific outcome. But those are difficult questions that we can't wait for which we can't wait another 20 years. Those are things that we need to decide today or yesterday. So long-winded answer, Brittney, I apologize.
No, you're good.
And I'm going to play a counterpoint to Gabriele of he's talking about flooding. I'm actually at a conference where we've been talking about drought. And one of the other sides of projected climate is more frequent droughts. And drought is part of a climate in the upper Midwest but usually not too extended periods of drought. So we assume that we're always going to have access to water. And in some cases, we can't always assume that water is going to be available, either because of the climate making it not available, or we're increasing our water use. We have a very serious drought going on right now around the Midwest, where we have problems with water limitations in various places that has not reached a critical level yet, but has reached a level of seriousness. And, the Southwest and California are built around, they built their water systems to try, and the drought there is even overcoming their systems. We need to also think about that in the upper Midwest, how we deal with water limitations when they are going to happen.
Yeah, Dennis, that's a really good point, because we think of Iowa crop production as rain fed, and most of the time we get plenty of rainfall, and we have the capacity of our soils to hold a lot of moisture, right? But from an infrastructure standpoint, when we get into these drought conditions, we don't have the infrastructure set up right now to irrigate a large number of acres. There's some here and there, but that's probably the biggest agricultural deficiency from an infrastructure standpoint. We tend to be able to plant acres really quickly, fertilize, spray, harvest, very timely for the most part. But when it comes to irrigation or responding to drought, that's a deficiency.
Gabriele mentioned that we need to be doing more proactive management with our infrastructure updates. How widespread are we seeing that proactiveness in Iowa in your experience, panelists?
So I'll jump in real quick. So are we being proactive? I think, from a year to year, severe weather in the ag side of things, yeah, we're probably, doing what we can there. But if we think about intermediate or long term, I think there's a number of things that we need to be doing, just for that resilient crop production. So we may need to be looking at different crops within our rotation. We may need to be looking at increasing the amount of no tillage or high residue systems out there. And right now, I think we're playing the game of, when do we really need to make that change versus, in adapting, kind of year by year versus thinking long term and how quickly, can we do this to help prepare us.
Iowa, I think I can share this. Iowa is working on a new drought plan. So I would say that I think there's more happening on the planning side. I guess I'd be curious what Aaron or Tam have to say about this, since they're closer to the ground. Probably more on the planning and thinking ahead side rather than actual changes in physical infrastructure, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess regarding what we're doing, in the utility space, I think one of the things that we're struggling with, it's, for us, it's not necessarily at the state level where, there are things that are happening one way or another. For us, it's more kind of at the federal level and things like that for what we do. But, what we're looking at is how do we come up with an industry standard way to approach this? Because, if one utility says we're going to really prepare for, the worst events, and they have to justify that to their regulators, and for, the companies like Alliant Energy and others in the state, they are, I guess, responsible to the state government for that. And so, if you come in and say, I want to do more than my peers because I'm further ahead in my planning, you might get in trouble for that. You might not receive approval for that. And so we're trying to develop a way that we can all find the best way to move forward and really explain the reasons why we need to do these things. As far as for our part, what we can do is we can be ready and prepared to reduce those restoration times and make sure that, if the power does go out, it can come back soon. But it is, it's something that I think in the electric utility industry, we're really trying to tackle those problems right now, figure out where do we go from here.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that, housing is a big issue in Linn County specifically, and within a lot of municipalities throughout Linn County. And so just to highlight, I think, I do think there's a lot of planning happening within our county. For example, we're working on our internal sustainability plan right now, and something that is unsurprising that's come up a lot is access to housing, and again, that quality affordable housing. And so I think the CDBG disaster recovery funds that have been that are flowing through HUD to through our state to our county is a really good example of proactive policy around housing specifically. There's a lot of incentives to create energy efficient housing, putting on PV systems. And so I think that is, in my opinion, a really good example of policy that aims to address multiple needs, right? The need to provide housing, but then also to ensure that when we're building this housing, it's thinking about that long-term impact that it can have on our local community. And so just so I think that's an example of good policy. Some of the challenges and I think areas of opportunity that I've observed is, education within the trades, so to make people more willing to engage in this type of work. I've heard that can be a challenging piece of the puzzle with developers because it's new things, right? And typically people are sad when they have to try and figure out a new system. And so providing support systems kind of throughout that process, right? Because this is federal money that's now flowing locally, and each step of the way, is kind of a decision point where things can go in a different direction, right? And so just making sure that when we're thinking about some of these policies, that we're also making taking a holistic approach to ensure that what we think and want to happen actually ends up happening all the way downstream.
We've mentioned some of the resources that we need to, mitigate this extreme weather. Can we kind of go more into that? Like, what resources are available on all levels of government to help combat extreme weather events in Iowa? If anyone wants to jump in.
Well, I guess one thing I can mention is, as we've been trying to develop a plan with our utility infrastructure, there was at the federal level passed a sort of a guideline for how utilities can try to approach that, and different states have also developed requirements for what types of events that you need to be looking at. So I think that's something, to the best of my knowledge, that's not something that's going on here in Iowa. I think each of us, utilities, we're trying to work together, and with our peers and, and experts in the field to try to develop that best way forward. But it's mostly, not in the government realm that we're moving ahead.
Yeah, I would just something I think there are many examples of this. One that I'll choose to highlight again is this kind of need to coordinate efforts across all entities that are responding to disasters. And again, taking the time in between the disasters to really build the relationships with our utility providers, right? With municipal governments in the county, with nonprofits. So then when this happens, everyone kind of knows what it is that they're aiming to do, or their role in that part, or sorry, their role in the response, right? So we don't have people just kind of stepping over one another, making decisions that don't make sense because they just assume that this is what people need, or this is the best thing to be doing in this space, which in times of disaster, really you want to know exactly what your marching orders are and to execute. And to highlight, kind of an example, I guess, of something that I think was done with good intention, but ended up probably not being the most helpful thing, right, is a lot of people were donating food to certain parts of the community that needed it immediately following that derecho event. But a lot of, depending on where you were, there's culturally relevant foods that people will choose to eat. And it's not just like it wasn't to the point where, oh, we're going to eat whatever. People actually weren't taking donated food because it wasn't something that was a part of their normal diet, right? And so people who were thinking that they're, doing a good thing, those efforts probably could have actually been refocused or reshifted to something that was more appropriate for the need of that community. But how would you know that if you don't have those systems and communication systems in place to be able to elevate that information to the people who need to hear it, right? And so thinking about how we also empower local entities and local nonprofits, smaller nonprofits to be decision makers in these disaster times. So it's not, again, waiting from the top down to get every little bit of information that we need in that time.
I think agriculture has some good programs in place, partly because we've been working with the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy for a number of years now. NRCS and other organizations have really been talking about and promoting and working with soil health initiatives. And, so while they weren't necessarily designed, to deal with weather events or weather impacts, they do help agriculture be more resilient in those times. And so I think we do have some things in place. Obviously, I think there's more work to be done there, and we need to keep moving forward with those. Fortunately, there's some nice cost share programs that help with various aspects of that. And then we just have a robust crop insurance program that does help us, recover and respond relatively quickly.
And I think what's come up is, I think it's an important point to differentiate when we're talking about resiliency. The initial one is trying to do things so that your system is more resilient to when a major system happens. So like building buildings or putting up power lines so that when severe weather happens, they don't get damaged. So that's a first part of resilience, which sometimes takes a bit more effort, sometimes takes rebuilding.